I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer for Gold Derby, and I'm joined today by Matthew Flood Ferguson, the production designer of Netflix's Dahmer Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. So, Matthew, obviously, most people are aware of sort of the basic facts about Jeffrey Dahmer and his killing spree, and there have been many projects about him throughout the past few years and decades. But what was the extent of your knowledge about Jeffrey Dahmer, about his crimes, and specifically the environment in which they were allowed to continue over the course of those 13 years before you signed on to the project?
The one thing I remember was the story about Konarak, the young Laotian boy that
Hmm.
was one of Dahmer's victims, and that the police actually he escaped, and then the police brought him back to Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer lied, said that they were lovers, and they left him there. And I remember hearing that and just being so horrified by it. But other than that, I don't really remember much more. I just remember him getting caught and thinking he looked like a regular guy and how scary that was.
Hmm. I think it's interesting that you mentioned that specific piece of information that you remembered. Is that something you remembered, at the time, or was it something you read about like many years later?
No, I remember it at the time. And I
At the
remembered
time.
just the uneasy, uncomfortable feeling that it gave me and how
Hmm.
horrible it was. And so that was definitely a very strong memory of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I can absolutely imagine. And then, on top of that, then came the research process. There was obviously a lot of research involved for this project, especially because due to the scope of this story and also the fact that it's told from several different point of views. So talk a little bit about your research process and also the range of your sources, because I know you're someone who likes to, actually go to the bookstore and look at images. So what was your preparation process
I
like for
do.
this show? Yeah.
Well, it was daunting, it was because I knew I would be looking at crime scene photos. We
Right.
recreated his apartment, the Oxford apartments. We recreated Glinda's apartment. And so it was going through quite a bit of images of and videos from the crime scene. And so that was kind of painstaking because my set decorator, Melissa Licht, and Helen Harwell, our art director, we
Hmm.
worked really hard to recreate that set accurately. And there were so many clues in his apartment that led to the horror that was going on behind closed doors. Um, so there's the factual research that I do, but then I do go to bookstores, and I like to go through and look at images for sort of tonal inspiration and
Interesting.
try to bring those together.
Yeah, and you already mentioned, Jeffrey's apartment. That's obviously the most important location on the show. And you said that you had to lean on or use primarily crime scene photos in order to recreate that space. Were you able to recreate that entire apartment from these crime scene or with help of
Yes.
these crime scene photos, or was there any room left for some imagination?
There really wasn't.
Okay.
It's pretty accurate. We were able to get enough photos to piece it together. I also found a floor plan
Wow.
that may have been used in a court um, case. So we were able to really recreate it pretty accurately.
Wow.
And Melissa, like I said, worked really hard to find, all those different elements that were in his apartment when the police discovered, what lied behind that door. Um, the one thing is it was a small apartment and it was very
Right.
claustrophobic. It was important that actually the entire show felt sort of claustrophobic and dark. So Helen and I worked pretty hard in creating walls that were on hinges so that crew could come and go.
Hmm.
Jason McCormick, our DP, had some very specific shots that he wanted to get. So, for instance, one in the bedroom, and we had a wall. It was a shared wall with the bathroom. So we put
Hmm.
that wall on a hinge so that the grips could open it up and the camera could get back here and we could actually shoot Jeff and Tony Hughes the way Jason wanted to shoot it.
Oh. And something else you've said is that you wanted the apartment to have a very specific, you wanted the apartment to have a smell, which I find so fascinating because when I was watching the show, I felt like every time we were in his apartment, I felt like I could smell it. Every time we're in Glenda Cleveland's apartment, I felt like I could smell whatever was coming through those vents.
The
So
vent.
yeah, exactly through the vent. So how did you go about translating that idea of wanting the room to have such a smell?
Well, to me, I think it's in the color and the tone of
Yeah,
the walls.
yeah.
I will say, going back to the research, the walls in his apartment were actually a sort of a dingy off-white.
Hmm.
And when I met with Ryan Murphy, in the beginning, one of the first things we talked about was the palette. And on every show with Ryan, he always talks about the color palette. And he wanted a very dingy yellow. So going back to his apartment, we did change the wall color and we gave it more of a dingy, dirty yellow. And then Barry Jones, my lead scenic painter, and we went through and we aged the walls and kind of put a patina, sort of a tobacco stain over everything to
Hmm.
kind of help visually sell the smell of his apartment.
And it was very successful because, like I said, every time I was in that apartment, I just wanted to leave there because you just feel so uncomfortable in there. I think it's sort of a combination of the production design, the cinematography. You just feel so immersed in that space, and you really don't want to be in that space. So I think that turned out
No.
really well. No, you really don't. And just one thing briefly about his apartment still, because there's some pictures here or there. I believe there are two in his living room, for example. But on the whole, his apartment is pretty hollow, pretty soulless in a way, pretty characterless. And I wonder, do you think that has to do with the fact that he never really had a home? Because if you think about it, he went from being in the Dahmer residence, which already wasn't much of a home, to being in a dorm room at Ohio State, to being, at the Army, to being at his grandmother's house. So do you think him being shipped from, one place to the next had an influence on how he treated his personal space and in turn was reflected in the way, his apartment is designed?
Yes, I do. Very much so. He was abandoned as a
Yeah.
kid and lived in his childhood home for a while. And so I do think that. I think that during the research, his apartment was somewhat furnished. So he rented it somewhat furnished. So, like the blue
Interesting.
silk curtains, the sofa, the chair, they were there, the lamps. But the little odd photos that you said he brought in. But yeah, I think he was a loner, obviously,
Hmm.
and really never had a home or an environment that he lived in or felt a part of, I
Hmm.
would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is that it's sort of the complete opposite of that. Maybe not complete opposite, but the opposite of that is Glenda Cleveland's apartment,
Right.
which is another central space because we spend so much time there. And I feel like we become so protective of it throughout the show. And a lot of that has to do with the production design and the set decoration. You said earlier that you were also leaning on some photos there as well. But, what was your overall approach when it came to designing her apartment, which is just so much lighter, so much more inviting, so much warmer than Jeffrey's apartment?
Well, I definitely wanted to feel homey and
Hmm.
lived in and inviting. It would needed to be period correct. Um, and so that was important because it was such a stark contrast to the horrors that were going right next door.
Yeah.
And there was the connective tissue of the vent where she could
Hmm.
smell and hear what was going on. So that was always kind of looming over her head. Um, there were a few pictures that we found of Glenda, the real Glenda Cleveland, in her
Hmm.
apartment. I worked off of that. And then the layout of the apartment, Helen and I decided that we would just flip the layout of Jeffrey's apartment and it would be the same thing, but in reverse,
Interesting.
if that makes sense, what I'm saying. So that
Yeah,
so that
absolutely.
the apartment, the rooms, would line up. Um, the one thing, I spoke with Ryan many times, and a big thing was the vent, because we start on the vent. Actually, we start with Glenda, really Glenda's intro, the whole series, and
Hmm.
her, living next to this this heinous crime. But the placement of the vent, should it be high? Should it be low? Should it be to the left? So we sort of, after the space was roughly built, we laid it out and figured what would make sense. We ended up with putting it up high.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever she's looking at it, we know it's, connected to Jeff. Glenda was a victim as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and like I said, every time, and like I said, we kind of feel protective of that space, so that when Jeffrey walks in there and we have that sandwich scene, you almost feel like he's invaded a space and you just want him to leave. You're like, get out of there during that scene. So I think that's so interesting. And Glenda Cleveland is obviously a composite character, sort of an amalgamation of the real life Glenda Cleveland, who lived in an adjacent apartment building, and one of his actual neighbors, I believe, Pamela Bass. So did that in any way influence the way you approached the design of her apartment, or did that not really impact your process that much?
Not so much, and you're exactly right, because Glenda Cleveland actually lived across next door. She is the one that saw the young boy and did call the police. And at the end of that episode, I think it's episode 2.
Yeah. We
hear the 911 exchange, which is the actual Glenda Cleveland. Pamela Bass, I believe was her name. She actually, I think, lived across the hall.
Yes.
So we decided those two characters would become one, because there wasn't enough time to tell that story, and that would put it next to Jeff's apartment.
Yeah, like you said, she is absolutely a victim. Even if we're dealing with an amalgamation of characters here, I think the message came across very well. And now I'd like to go back in time a bit, because like we talked about, you had photos to go off of for Jeffrey's apartment, but you didn't necessarily for some of the other spaces he inhabited throughout his life, like the homes of his father and his grandmother. And what I think is interesting about those spaces is that we kind of perceive them from his perspective, because we kind of see them as he passes through them. So with that in mind, what was the mood and the atmosphere that you wanted to evoke with each of these two spaces? So the Dahmer residence and his grandmother's home.
Bleak and dark and claustrophobic. Going back to research, when I do go to bookstores and I go through so many books, I came across a photographer named Chauncey Hare. Actually, someone overheard me and came up to me and said, "You should check out this photographer named Chauncey Hare." And I got his books and I looked through them, and there was something triggered in me, and there was just this bleakness to his images. And I thought, that's it. Not necessarily what's in the photo, but the tone of that.
Right.
So I knew I wanted to have wood paneling, and I wanted wood in a lot of environments. So that was very important. We built Catherine Dahmer's house, Jeffrey's grandmother, who he lived with, and that was a 3-story home. I had a couple of photographs of Jeffrey. I think he's in a wingback chair, and there's a small video he's playing with his dog. And then I had an exterior shot of the real house. Other than that, everything else was sort of imagined. So the TV room, which is where Jeff and his grandmother watch TV, and there's a lot of scenes in there. I knew from the beginning I wanted it to be wood paneling. It just echoes a time period, and it also it's dark, and it can be kind of unattractive. And the same with his childhood home. And we scouted many, many homes, and Catherine Kagan, my location manager, and I came across his house that I loved. And it was very original, and it had a low wood ceiling. And I thought, this is perfect. So we did a few augmentations to the interior to close it off a little bit. And then we redressed it and changed it. But so I was very pleased with both of those locations.
Yeah, and you said, sort of dark and sort of, claustrophobic. And with regard to his childhood home, I'd also say, again, it's very hollow, it's very cold, it's very lonely, especially when Jeffrey's there by himself. And what I think is interesting is that it stands in complete contrast to Lionel's second home with his second wife, Sherry, because that home is so much brighter, so much homier, which is a word you've used throughout this talk. I mean, you've got these floral fabrics everywhere, and you've these much softer tones. So again, was creating such a clear contrast a conscious choice of yours?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And with Sherry, his second wife, that was sort of to introduce, it was her, home and her style to kind of bring in some kind of a little bit of a cheeriness and a bit of hope, at least for Lionel, Jeffrey's father. So that was a very conscious choice. And again, with Melissa Licht, the decorator, we looked at all kinds of fabrics and furniture and to kind of help create Sherry's world in that house so that it felt different, very different from Jeffrey's childhood home.
Yeah, that was actually something where I was, reading up about the different sets, and that was something where I had to go back and actually looked at the two, sort of compared them. I was like, oh my God, I didn't, that's not necessarily something you pick up on immediately, but if you go back, you will just see how much of a difference there is. And I think that it was utterly fascinating. On a final note, I do want to mention one more set because I believe it is from what I've read, that it's one of your favorite sets to have worked on, which is the Ambassador Hotel, which is where one of the murders obviously occurs. So what about that set? And I guess specifically that one hotel room, what about working on it was so exciting for you?
It was a set we built on stage, and this may not make sense, but it really, that set and Catherine Dahmer's bathroom on the second floor of her house, those two sets were really came from one thing. And with the Ambassador Hotel, it was the fabric. Melissa and I had looked through a series of, a bunch of fabrics, and we came across a swatch, and I'm like, that's it. And from that swatch of fabric, we literally built the whole set. And everybody got involved. The art director, Helen, Regina Henderson, our draper, Melissa, myself, and the set designers. And it was very fast. It came together very fast, but it was fun, and it was a collaboration. And so that's why I like that set, because it was such a great collaborative effort. They all are, but that was such a quick collaborative effort. And I was very pleased with the final look. And it's the same with the bathroom. It was a wallpaper that I found, and I'm like, that's it. So hopefully that makes sense. But I love those sets, and I love the process and the outcome I was very pleased with.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, the Ambassador Hotel, for me, when I think about it, I just think about, the scene that takes place there, which is absolutely awful. But I'm so glad that you shared that piece of information with us. I fear we're out of time now, but thank you so much for joining me today. It was such a pleasure to talk to you about this project.
Thanks for having me.